Good morning, everyone. So I'm the guy that gets to bring everyone back together after the break. So that's awesome. A little bit of background about who I am. Like Sarah mentioned, I'm Derek's counterpart in Illinois. I've been doing community development for about 8 years now. And whenever I say I'm from Illinois, all of you think I'm from Chicago, probably. Think Chicago. Now strip everything away that you know about Chicago, think the opposite. That's where I'm from. I'm all the way down south. And it's actually interesting to me to be working in regionalization now and doing these projects because where I grew up in southern Illinois, we're actually part of a very large regional system. In Illinois, we're just like it sounds like you guys are in Pennsylvania. We have kind of a hodgepodge of a little bit of everything. We have some larger regional systems, and then of course we have bukus of independent, smaller systems. Where I'm at, the system actually spans, it's as rural as it gets, okay? Very low population, but it spans 13 counties, probably serves 50 communities, 250,000 people, so very large regional systems. That's what I'm used to, but then I come into the regional space and again, I find out it's very different in other places, so that's interesting. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and do our first bit of group work. If you look around, each table should have a whiteboard and then some markers. And you're going to write all of everything you talk about down essentially on the whiteboard. And then I'm going to go around the room and I'm going to have a spokesperson from each table inform everyone else of the discussion and tell us what you got on the whiteboard. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you about 15 minutes to do that. So, Yeah, so I'm going to give you about 15 minutes to do that. It's 10:40 now, so about 10:55. At about 10:55, we'll get back together and we'll go through the whole room and have everyone, their spokesperson, stand up and talk at one time. Alright, we're going to go ahead and kick things off with table 1 and have their spokesperson share their thoughts.
Yeah, who's spokesperson?
I'll do it.
I mean, you got some good point. I would vote for you.
Okay, our last.
Because you have some real experience. I mean, sounds like I'll call you if I ever try to consolidate.
Moving forward, also
Secretary cooking.
trust amongst the political parties that are considering collaboration. Cost had to do with money up front of one system that is maybe in better financial position, taking over another system that's not. It could be a complicated, long-term process, going through several steps. Communication between the entities could be poor, and also to establish certain lines of communication between between the entities and the topics you're talking about. Differences in rates between the entities, and the human capital and staff that's involved between the parties that are talking.
Excellent. Thank you. Great job. One thing I want to talk about, something off that list, is the human capital. This actually came up at our table too, and it's discussions we've had this morning. I think Derek highlighted it, is a lack of interest by the younger generation. There's actually, I've heard stories at different conferences that I've been to of entire communities actually unincorporating because they couldn't find people to serve. So I think it's just an interesting discussion to have and something we're going to continue to see unfold at a high level across the country over the next few years. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it to table 4 here.
A lot of what you're going to hear from me is similar to what Rick just said. We added the big elephant politics. Won't go into that in detail. Misinformation, the rumor mill that occurs in small communities. We started the conference with a lack of trust. That's related to everything. Similarly, a loss of control, particularly if one system is much smaller than the larger one. The smaller one is always going to be scared of this. Loss of a vested interest when there's some type of regionalization between parties. Lack of knowledge at all levels, and the rumor mills. The issue related to funding sources and how they perceive regionalization. And there certainly could be benefits, I would believe, in getting funding if entities would consider regionalizing, but there's how this interrelates with funding sources, participation, and then one thing we talked about somewhat at length at the end was the true cost. What is the true cost of water? It's not just somebody's salary, it's everything that's involved with their salary and benefits and the operation of the system. And the folks who are on these small systems really don't have an idea of the true cost, and maybe if they did, it'd be easier to consider some type of regionalization. So that's our list.
Absolutely, good job. And the true cost is an interesting one because I find that a lot of the small communities that I go into in Illinois, it's kind of the Wild West in terms of regulation. It's pretty lax on the rates. So everyone thinks they know what their true cost is, but more often than not, every time we actually look at the true cost, way off. So just keep that in mind.
Okay, we covered a lot of what's already been discussed, so I'll talk about some of the aspects of that, social media in particular. When you talk about misinformation, there's no greater generator of misinformation than social media. So we've had that at West Branch as well. We actually have no Facebook page because it was too much of a burden to keep the negative stuff under control. The process is going to be difficult, so you need a referee. You need a neutral party because it's going to be a fight. Finding one is difficult. I actually, as the engineer back in the day, was the neutral party, and I wasn't with the numbers. I tried to stay as neutral and non-political as possible, but you really need a referee because it is going to be a fight. We talked about driving factors. So for ours in particular was the Chesapeake Bay improvements essentially required us to form an authority as the only feasible solution. But what we've seen in the past is, particularly on the water side, these small systems will have problems, and the inspector will come out and will list the problems and say, you got to work on that, but there's not a big driving factor there that would be bad enough or strong enough to force regionalization, where they actually have to fix those things. So the mechanisms that we have on a regulatory basis are kind of atomic bomb or nothing. And so having something in the middle would be great. But that does, it keeps regionalization from occurring. And then ultimately, lack of knowledge about what is required to run a system. So when you do your comparisons, you've got to look at apples and apples, not apples and oranges. So I know one failed regionalization I was asked to consult on. The engineer looked at the cost of operation as is, so the existing small systems that were not doing it right, and then the cost of the regional authority to do it right. And so that's way different cost structures. You have to get them to understand, if you're going to operate a system, you got to do asset management. You got to do 100-year cycle of replacement. Get them to agree on a framework, and then price the framework that everybody independently hits the framework, or we do it together, and then we'll see the big cost savings. So that's essentially what we have.
Awesome. All great points.
Who wants to do six?
I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, I was going to go down the back and then I'll come back through the middle.
Oh, okay.
If you also, I know a lot of the points have already been hit on. So if there's one that's already been hit on and you don't want to talk about it, or you just want to highlight your top three, we're limited for time anyway. So if you just want to hit your top three or so, that's fine as well. So.
Interesting you say top three. We did have that discussion, what would be the top three, and what we concluded was the top three are going to be different for every community based on the circumstances and the situations. And a lot of what we have is what was previously discussed. Some of the things I'll just highlight on is turfdoms, ownership issues. People like to play in their own sandbox. One of the things, when you look at lack of capacity, not capacity of the system from a volume standpoint or a supply standpoint, but really from people who are willing to serve on the board, people who are willing to champion a project through. One of the things we put was champion to facilitate action. Often you'll have communities with people that will come to meetings and all that, and they agree that, hey, this is really a good idea, but you really have to have someone who's committed and who's going to be the champion, just follow it through and see it through to the end and to the completion. And that's one of the difficult things, regardless of the issue, is making sure that those communities have a champion who's willing to take that burden and carry that through to completion. Any other comments? I think the rest were pretty much hit on by everybody else.
Okay, well, let me see, well, a lot of ours were hit on. When I say, I want to clarify old school, because I meant old school mentality, we talked about is, change is hard. So, I mean, of course, that's pretty obvious for most of the communities, and, why they're not going to want to combine in the disagreements between the local communities. And of course, all the rules and regulations that are going to govern in the community that makes it difficult. You have to get attorneys involved and legal. So how difficult is that going to be to make people who are just going to want to say, never mind, let's just forget about this. This is too difficult. We talked about with some of the smaller communities where, it's even hard to find people to run the small systems. Some of those people are just volunteers that are, maintaining the systems or being called out in the middle of the night, and they're only on a volunteer basis. So what happens when you go to combine some of these many communities together? How are you going to operate those systems in that sense and find that coverage? So those are just some of the things I think that, maybe we didn't talk about so far that we covered.
Okay, so a lot of our issues were also covered, but we did talk first about the Commonwealth structure. So those of you from Pennsylvania know that not many things are done at the county level in Pennsylvania, so I think this leads to a lot of the discussion about the individual and small municipal systems or neighborhood systems. The other thing I was struck by in the conversation at the break was, the people that are running the system or the volunteers are struggling just to find enough time and resources to deal with the day-to-day issues, and may want to sort of have somebody facilitate, like GLCAP, the discussions, but they may find it hard to get people to be able to do that. We also talked a bit about being reactive rather than proactive. So what I see in my day-to-day job is a lot of these discussions don't happen until there's a crisis, and then everyone's scrambling to try and deal with the crisis. And there's some tools available to do that, but it just puts everything in a much different light than if you were doing it more as a long-term planning. And then the cost, we did end with that, but I think that's an important point that Derek made and others have made. Knowing the true cost is key. How you design the rates after that can be done in a myriad of ways, but knowing those true costs to begin with really is a key in my opinion.
A lot of the items that we looked at are very similar to everything that's already been announced or discussed. I think we could all agree on personalities and local rivalries being a large one there. Some of the things that have not been discussed too much, however, talk about physical barriers. Physical barriers primarily translates to a challenge to the engineer. How the devil do we connect this town to that town? Everyone knows that a good engineer loves a challenge. The trouble is when we bring our solution to that challenge back and put it on the table, that's when everyone turns white in the face and they try and figure out how the devil are we going to pay for this. So that's a big factor to try and figure out. One of the other things that hasn't discussed yet as well is liabilities. One of the primary liabilities there is when two communities come together and one says, hey, we're tired of this, we're done with it, we want to turn our water system over to you. They look at it and say, yeah, that would be great to have all of those customers. We don't want your ratty old distribution system, fix it first. So again, that's another major issue, and once again, that translates back to finances. And I think the last one that we talked about that's a little bit unique, a little bit of concern of the liability, of personal liability, both in terms of the individuals, DEP, everything across the board. Bottom line is we've got a couple communities trying to work together, figuring out how to put it together, and it says we'll take this system on, but there are problems there that have to be fixed, and they go to DEP and say, hey, can you give us a waiver on these rules for a little bit? DEP is going to look at it and say, no, we can't do that. might be able to negotiate something and put something down on paper, but they can't just close their eyes to it. Similarly, on the municipal end, if the municipalities or their operators take something on that just isn't right, can't be handled, and they say, we'll fix it as fast as we can, in the meantime, they're still putting their name to it, and they are personally liable. So these are a few things we talked about that I don't think have been touched on.
All right, some of the things that we did that were a little different than everybody else talked about. One of the big things was the economics. If I'm a water system where I have plenty of supply and I can attract commercial, industrial customers versus my neighbor, I want to maintain that because that gives me the tax base, it gives me some income and some control over being able to bring those larger customers in. If I combine with somebody, then I won't necessarily have that capability or that advantage over my neighboring community. The cost of the physical interconnections was talked about. You know, in Pennsylvania, we're either going up a hill or down a hill, mostly in on the southwestern side and the northern tier. Getting from one place to another physically is very difficult. It's costly. When you're dealing with small communities that have limited customers, typically the economies of scale play in, and it just does not become cost effective. The other one is fear of rate increases. A lot of these smaller rural communities fall under that fixed income classification. So there's just that ultimate fear of if we combine or come under a larger umbrella, we don't have as much local control, that those rates are going to increase. And then finally, the fear of expansion leading to less supply. So if we take on a neighboring community, we're supplying them with water, that's might impact us on the supply end.
We had a list of about 10 or 12 items, only a few that haven't been touched on, and some in various degrees. So we talked about the concern of lack of attracting a volunteer base for board members and such. But sometimes there's such a good old boy network in some of these neighborhoods that it's not a very welcoming environment for volunteers or for new people in the community to get involved. And so the encouragement there is to grab onto those new people and encourage them and help them get acclimated. Also, in that good old boy network, sometimes there's a lack of foresight for the greater good, and there are all of these unwarranted concerns about what regionalization might do for them. The other thing that we talked about that I don't think has been brought up yet is the turnover of qualified employees. There's quite a process to get certified in both clean water and wastewater, 2 years and 4 years, I understand. And so it's attracting employees, skilled employees, as there is turnover, and then retaining them long enough to get them certified in those areas and continuing to work for the organization.
I'd like to expand upon one that was brought up a short time ago, and that was the liability. One of the things that we've seen happen in the past, where you'll have we know that you have part-time folks running these small systems, trying to make decisions for a system that's been you're making decisions once a month for an industry that takes full-time knowledge and full-time involvement. And these folks are trying to serve their community, doing it often as volunteers or very, very low pay. Next thing you know, they're doing the best they can and find out that they feel somewhat responsible for the direction that the place may be going, and it may be negative. So then a bigger player comes and gets involved and starts considering what can we do to help. And you have these folks that are now at the point where it's bad enough, there might be a consent order involved. There's legal and binding agreements that have come to play. There's penalties that have already been negotiated to this small system. And now, as a larger system, those folks are faced with how are we going to deal with these things? And the complete opposite of the control issues that we're used to seeing people have can also occur, where you already folks that are ready to drop the keys in your lap and run for the hills. And you can have a hard time even getting them back together again to even take the appropriate actions to make the transitions occur. So the liability that's out there, you have folks that are not industry professionals signing agreements that maybe are legal documents that they didn't even really understand and didn't realize what they were agreeing to. They might have thought because they negotiated a fine down $30,000 or $40,000 they were constituents, and then find out that they couldn't meet the obligations. Again, the liability that that person faces, it really haunts them, and they just might want out. One topic that was brought up that I think is a really good thing to point out is acquisitions often take a substantial amount of time. That's been a general consensus across the room, and a lot of times you'll have folks in those positions being elected out, new folks coming in, and the need to re-educate somebody new or multiple new members of a board in the middle of a process that's many years long can end up also being a challenge. And you can also think about the fact that if there is a regionalization project, you're always going to have small groups of people that might oppose that type of thing, who could very easily try to intervene someone in an election year to try and upset that or put somebody on the board that may not be a nice player. So that's another challenge with re-educating new board members and new members coming on board in the process. Real big one, everyone knows the dollar is running everything these days, and the huge lack of incentives for someone who's trying to help save a small system. And we could probably talk all day about that, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. Legal complexities, everyone knows about that, but I'll talk about one. Everyone realizes and thinks about the water and wastewater related things, but there's also things that get forgotten about on the legal side. Everyone knows you're going to take a system over, you have permits to transfer, you have walking into a system that's dilapidated, you have mechanical repairs, you need to staff it. Like, these are all known things. But then you find out things like, again, boards were often run by people who had a different profession. You find out easements were never dedicated. You find out there's property, a pump station's on that maybe was never dedicated over from the original developer. And there's all these legal ghosts that are hiding that come up even years into the process that have to be dealt with. And then we go into the financial aspect where you have to go into these types of things knowing up front you're going to uncover a lot of things that no one even realized were problems. And then you end up uncovering them, and you need to have the financial resources to deal with all of those problems along the way. And it's extremely difficult to plan ahead and know up front, how do I plan for this? How do I plan for how much capital I'm going to need or how much resources I'm going to devote to an acquisition when so many unexpected things come up?
Thank you. All right, in the interest of time, my last few tables. Looks like you guys might get scapegoated out here. Is there anything that you guys all had at the last few tables that nobody else has mentioned? Volunteers, and don't lie to me.
I think one was the difference in timing, life cycles of the two of competitive systems or different.
Okay, so you like the infrastructure in the systems? Is that what you're referring
Yeah.
to when they were installed?
Build up, maintain, manage.
Yeah.
You have a curve there for how they're maintained. And motivation was one of them, keeping everyone motivated, but I believe everything else was covered. Better than that.
Okay. What about the last two tables there?
Our big one was, and I think it covers a lot, is just education.
Okay, education.
Just helping the systems understand the reasons why, the benefits, and understanding and planning for the future, and understanding what it might look like down the road. I think that's a real general comment, but that's really important from day one.
Yeah, and it's important on the education barrier and impediment. It's so multifaceted, right? There's so many different things that go into that. That's definitely a good point. About the last table.
The only thing we thought of that everybody wasn't being table 14, we're lucky everything was already covered, was the communication, which tied in with the education, and communicating even after the process is done, that there's a cost to maintaining the assets. So many systems will put into the state of the art, they'll buy the Cadillac, but they can't change the oil every 3 to 5 months. And you can't. And it needs the money, it needs it maintained. You still need to put tires on it.
Right.
At least my husband says that.
Yeah, certainly.
Question for Eric. One thing I was thinking, as you were saying about your comment, do you think that some local or some small communities have a false sense of security and don't realize that they're kind of teetering on the edge, that they're running too close to not being resilient? Is that part of lack of knowledge?
The systems I'm dealing with, they know they're on the edge.
Yeah.
They're falling, you're now falling off there. That's the ones I'm dealing with. I don't know if that's not answering your question, but,
Well, mine would be more the ones that are township ran as opposed to volunteer ran. Now answer that question. Are the people that are running are the people that's running the townships in better than before? Because that was part of your question, right? On what he saw, things overall of how they were doing.
Yeah, I guess I wonder if there are some systems that don't realize that that their assets are in bad shape.
There are definitely.
oh,
Yes.
yes. And it's evidenced by the biggest thing, rates.
Yeah.
The undervalue of the resource, knowing, and we said this 1,000 times, a lot in this room, knowing the true cost to produce safe drinking water.
I keep getting flagged down by Sarah because I'm going over my time,
I just want
so.
to make a quick comment on that, and then we're going to close. But I would just say, we do a workshop, and some of you may have participated in it before. We call it Workshop in a Box, but it's something that was developed by both USDA and EPA, and it's really about sustainable utility management. And we did one in Massachusetts with both water and wastewater systems, and we had a system come in, and when you do the training, you do a self-analysis on 10 key management areas, and you really assess, am I doing this really well? Am I doing it okay, but have room for improvement? Or is this one of my weaker points? And there were 2 guys that were on the board of a small system that was not municipal, and they were all volunteer run, and they had aging infrastructure, and they were in complete denial of the fact that there were imperfections in their system. They did their self-rating, and they rated themselves as perfect in all 10 categories, which was shocking to me. And then it was interesting because once we split the 2 of them up into separate groups and kind of got them talking, one of the gentlemen in one of his other groups finally, when he was away from the other guy, was able to admit that they did have some challenges and maybe they didn't get a perfect score. But I've definitely seen a lot of folks that they may think that things are not great or may think that things are bad, but they might not realize how bad things are. But there are definitely systems that are in denial about some of their strengths and weaknesses. So thank you, Zach. We're going to close. This discussion isn't done. We're going to be talking more later about how we overcome some of these challenges.